Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's Carey Nieuwhof here. And David, hello. Happy, I don't know, whatever day people are listening to this.
That's right. Well, happy whatever date, everyone.
And Siri's saying, I didn't get that. Come on, Siri, I didn't say that. Oh, now she's going to talk to me again. Do you ever have that where Siri just like goes off or Alexa goes off in the middle of the day and you're like, what? I wasn't talking to you.
Yeah. One of the phrases in our family is seriously, because we like to joke with each other. And so that always kicks Siri into action. So it's seriously.
Oh, that's funny. Thanks, David. Thanks.
Yeah,
Now
exactly.
she won't stop, right? Yeah. I've said, if AI ever takes over, I've said terrible things to Alexa and Siri when I get frustrated. And I'll be the first one to be voted off Earth, I think, when the AI takes over.
Fair enough.
They remember. Well, I'll tell you, these are complex times, continuing to be complex times. And Barna Group is doing a collab. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that on generosity?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The idea behind what Barna has been doing for so many years is really trying to track trends and, kind of understand the times. And we felt as a team, as a leadership team, especially the last 18 months, but this is something that's been growing for a number of years for me as we lead Barna, is that we don't want to just understand the times. We also want to know what to do. And so my good colleague, good friend, Joe Jensen, who has spent a lot of his career working for some of the larger churches in America, came on staff a couple of years ago. And we've been slowly and surely developing tools for leaders. And so collab is one of those tools. We've done now a number of different collabs for churches, 6-week learning journey, cohort. And in this case, we're actually going to be working with Generis. We'll be talking a little bit with some leaders from Generis today about accelerating generosity. And so there's a new collab coming up. We'll be talking about all sorts of interesting things, maximizing year-end giving, activating non-givers, discipling people toward generosity. And you'll get the chance to sort of deeply interact with other leaders, Barna staff. And then you've also got a chance to deploy a custom generosity assessment from Barna for your congregation. So it gives you a chance to look kind of underneath the covers and see how are we doing at a heart level in terms of our congregation, and not just are they giving dollars, but like what's happening. And as we've said, the metrics of success, the metrics of effective ministry are changing. It's not just about whether people showed up or whether the dollars showed up, but whether you have engaged people, whether people's hearts are in it as well. And so I think this is going to be a great opportunity for you as church leaders to take a deeper dive on that.
Well, we're going to get in the weeds today. We've got Julie Bullock and Jim Sheppard from Generis who are going to join us in a few moments. And by the way, leaders, if you head on over to barna.com/collab, sign up for that, and then use the promo code ChurchPulse15, and you will get a discount for that. Also, we want to thank our friends at Belay. They're offering our listeners a free download of their resource, 5 Ways a Church Bookkeeper Can Transform Your Day, because I don't think too many pastors signed up to also be CPAs. So if you want a better handle on your church's finances, just text the word PULSE to 55123. That's PULSE to 55123 for your free download today. Again, that's PULSE to 55123. David, you've got some stats that we can have a look at, but why don't we bring Jim and Julie on right now? Jim is the principal and CEO of Generis, a consulting firm passionate about helping churches inspire and cultivate generosity through giving development. For the last 27 years, he's devoted his life to coaching pastors, especially in navigating the resource limitation that restricts professional ministry. He is the co-author of Contagious Generosity. And then Julie serves as the senior generosity strategist at Generis. Prior to joining Generis, she served as the director of stewardship and generosity at Community Christian Church, a multi-site church in Chicagoland with 13 locations. She also served as director of development for the New Thing Network, Community Churches Planting Network, and as a generosity coach to new plants and church planters. Julie and Jim, so glad to have you today.
Thanks, Carey.
Yeah. So David, walk us all through some stats. Barna's been doing its own research, and what are we learning right now? What are we seeing about the state of generosity?
Well, you remember the very early days of the pandemic, Carey, and we were having almost, sort of certainly weekly, but sort of regular check-ins with leaders. And so generosity has been on such an interesting trajectory the last 18 months. So a couple things. First, We know from current research that number one, 8 in 10 church-going Christians agree that their church informs their congregation about the impact that their giving has. So a pretty solid number, but could stand to grow. So visibility, transparency is reasonably high. 6 in 10 Americans say they view the church as generous. So 6 in 10 Americans say they believe Christian churches in their local community are generous. Among non-Christians, that's 42%. So it's still it's much lower, but it's still a decent number. And so there's I think a good opportunity to discuss this question of like, how do we sort of improve the reputation of the Christian community as a generous community? And then finally, another interesting stat we can tee up for our guest today is that 42% of Christians say it's very important that individual Christians donate money to their church. So it's a solid minority, 42% who says very important, but 13% say it's unimportant. So a really interesting kind of fragmentation of the audience. That's the way I would sort of say it as a market researcher is that there's some good trends here. Like we have some solid things to build from, but generosity, how Christians show up in terms of generosity in this unique moment coming out of the pandemic, as people are reevaluating their personal spending and priorities of finances. We have a great opportunity ahead of us to sort of reset the table for effective ministry and discipling people in terms of generosity.
Yeah, Jim and Julie, any initial reaction to some of those statistics? Do you find them surprising? Do they kind of confirm what you've been seeing as you meet with church leaders across America?
I think I had the reaction that David had, Carey. The fragmentation and the beliefs that are expressed there was interesting to note there. I do think 8 in 10 agree that their church informs their congregation about the impact their giving has. I think if we took that survey 2 years ago before COVID, I think that would be a distinctly lower number. I think churches have gotten really good at storytelling in this season because they had to. They didn't have much else to talk. By the way, not a long point I want to make here, but I think that's a lot to do with why so many churches have seen stability in this age. Julie and I have been big proponents of tell your church the stories. Everybody else is. You need to do that. And I would say the 42% of Christians that think it's important to donate money, that pretty much tracks with what I would have thought. Because that's probably my opinion based on looking at a lot of church databases. I think that's about the percentage of church members, active participants that actually do give to a church, somewhere in that range.
So it's more like 60-40 rather than 80-20.
Yeah.
You hear 80-20 a lot, 20% of the people give 80% of the money.
It's still going to be stacked. It's still going to be
Okay.
top heavy, but I mean that actually do contribute something. And when I say something, I'm going back to what George Gallup said some years ago. I haven't even adjusted it for inflation. He said, until somebody gives $500 to an organization, it doesn't have meaning to them.
Yeah.
And that's an older stat, but I've kind of hung on to that. It's just kind of, if you give 500 or more, I think that makes you a true giver in the church, at least at
Julie,
some point.
I want to hear from you, but I want to interject before we lose that thought. David, you've said before, because you're the social researcher, you're the scientist in the mix here, it can be difficult or can be dangerous to infer negative. So 42% think it's important. That doesn't necessarily mean that 58% think it isn't. But is it curious then that the majority of people don't think it's that important to give to the church? Like, can you infer that from that stat, or am I misreading the data?
Well, there's another group of people that were saying they think it's somewhat important. So that's another, I don't have the data right in front of me, but we have 42% on one end of the continuum who say it's very important, and then 13% who say it's unimportant. And then the middle of those that sort of say something of somewhat important or somewhat unimportant. As I was trained and then see this play itself out in data and real world scenarios, it's the top box percent that always makes the most. It tells us something about people's inclination to do something. So, we do a lot of predictions for people who go to theaters. Like, would you go to a theater to pay dollars, to go see a new film? So we've done some work for Paramount and DreamWorks and Sony and others. And it's always the percentage say they will definitely do something, and then you still discount it pretty significantly. So even if people say they probably will do something, you give them all, like, it's like a 1 in a 20 chance that someone who says they'll probably do something, even spending, 15, 20, 30 bucks on a movie ticket for their family, that they'll do it. Whereas even those who say they'll definitely do something. So there's really cool and pretty sophisticated tools that market researchers will use depending on the ticket item, And, whether there's like, I got to show up and get in the car and go do something, or whether it's an intent to do, volunteering or, a generosity. So when we're talking about 42% who agree strongly, or it was say that's very important, that is the group of people who say, yeah, this is actually something that's really important to me. It still doesn't even reflect, as sort of Jim is referring to, those that are going to actually do something on the basis of that. And
that's where I was going with it, because I kind of thought I would expect the vast majority of people to say, oh yeah, I believe this is important. Now, don't ask me what I give, but I believe it was important. But even at the assent level, it's a bit lower. Okay. See, it's conversations like this that make me want to quit my job and do what you do, David, because it's so fast. Really is. Thank you.
Well, we got an open spot here for you.
I'm good. You're hiring? Awesome. I'll send you my resume this afternoon. Okay. Julie, comments on the stats that you've heard.
That's great. I very much agree with what's been shared. And the only thing I would really add is there's this interesting dichotomy when you think about the giving to and the giving from that givers do in the church. And so sometimes when we think about trying to, and I hate to even say it this way, but I'm going to say it for the purpose of this survey to kind of, that was done. Sometimes people kind of try to compete for dollars, and the challenge and the opportunity that pastors really have in seeing a statistic like this and how we solve it isn't as much of, well, I've got to make my mission more compelling than the one down the street. It's more that there's a discipling opportunity in the giving from rather than the giving to, that I need to expand these people's whole charitable pie. I'm not necessarily wanting to steal dollars from somebody else to try to make my story more compelling than theirs, because they might very well be giving to other kingdom endeavors that are wonderful, but a lot of them aren't giving at all. And so, or they're giving very modestly where it's not a large priority in their life. And it's something more, as Jim was referencing, it's a token gift. And so really the discipling opportunity is this giving from, that the local church has the opportunity to expand, that all boats rise, that whenever the local church does what it does best in discipling givers, giving to your church rises, but giving to other kingdom enterprises also rise, because that's our unique role as disciplers in the local church, is actually teaching people how to give, not just how to give to your church. So there's an interesting opportunity in there that when we think about solving that and increasing and moving that, that's the only thing I would add. I agree with everything that's been shared, but that's our discipling opportunity, I think, even to move that needle, not just competing for dollars, but to say, well, how do we raise the bar in the giving from, if that makes sense?
One of the things that reminds me of is there's a set of data, and we're coming out with new stuff on teenagers coming up in 2022, global teens and millennials, Gen Z, teenagers. I'm convinced that they need a real apologetic of good, that Christianity isn't just true, it's also good, and it benefits our neighborhoods and the people we care about and our communities. And we talked about this earlier, that 42% of non-Christians in America would use the phrase generous to describe local Christian churches. It'd be awesome if part of, listeners take away from this would be like, how could we increase the perception in our community that the Christian community, that the Christian churches here are generous, and that it actually produces good in our community. I think that would be a real witness to the next generation. Just to your point, Julie, that, it's not just that we want people to be generous to our churches. We actually really want people to understand that, being a full-throated Christian means that we're generous in many, many ways of life, that then is a witness to this next generation Christianity. It isn't just true. It also changes how we steward and use our resources. And at its best, Christianity certainly does that. But I think we need to tell that story more clearly, that it's not just a transaction we're trying to, facilitate between giver and church that needs your money to keep the lights on, but it actually is a message of heart change.
That's excellent.
I would say too, David, just jumping in there real quick on that whole idea of the 42%, the one thing that does hit me there, and it's not purely in the data, but it's Jim's take on the data, is how little a church has to do in its community to be credited as generous. The standard for being judged as generous, Julie and I would say we would be a lot more stingy in the use of the word generous, that what people are calling generous, we wouldn't call it generous. And so the standard is so low right now because we're in such a me-centered culture that you really don't even have to do that much in your community to get credit as being generous. And that's really a part of the problem we're talking about here that Julie's referencing, is that we haven't been discipled correctly, so that we are just totally ignorant of what we might even be called to as Christ followers in light of Scripture. And so, we'll do this. And so Julie and I would even say to churches in the offering moment, don't talk about your church being a generous church. You don't even know that. You don't even know that. You're a giving church. But probably I would be very careful to use the word generous out there, because you don't know. You're presuming something there that might or might not be the case. They are givers, but you don't know if they're generous.
That's a good caveat. One of the, I think, great advantages we have in being able to have conversations with both of you today is you get to see the meta patterns. You get to talk to church leaders around the country and in some cases around the world. And I know, having been in the lead pastor seat for over 2 decades, sometimes it feels a little baffling, as like, why aren't people giving more? Like, why is this person a non-giver? Why does this person, spend X number of dollars on vacation and yet they faithfully give $50 a week to the church? Like, it seems like there could be an inversion of values or something. What are some of the lids on generosity that you've seen? Julie, I'll start with you. What are some of the lids to generosity that you see commonly among church attenders?
You bet. Yeah. Well, an old pastor a friend of mine used to use the 4 uns, and he used to say unable, unwilling, uninspired, and uninformed. And those 4 N's are really important, I think, as Jim and I do our work and we see, okay, dive into some of these things. A lot of times pastors will assume one of them, and they often assume the unable. They often think people in their church that aren't giving, it's because that they're unable, they're in too much debt, their spending is out of whack, and they often just default, well, I need some more Financial Peace University classes. And that may very well, usually is a great solution for a contingent of the people. There are people that are just unable to do it, or they perceive that they're unable to do it, is probably the more correct thing. But a lot of them are either unwilling because maybe there is some type of a misperception or something about the church that's a hindrance to them. And it's not that they're unwilling to give to the Lord, but they might be unwilling to give to this church or something they don't agree with. But a lot are not just uninformed and uninspired practically, but truly uninformed and uninspired spiritually. And so most churches that we work with, it's why Jim and I do what we do, love what we do, and even have such a large team that's needed to do what we do, is because most pastors, as we know, they might talk about it once a year. They only talk about it often whenever they need it. And so this constant nourishment of, as much as Jesus nourished us and the Apostle Paul and David, it's Old Testament and New. We all know how many times giving is referenced. That doesn't often play out in a mirrored image of what we see in Scripture for what we see in our churches. And so there's just, quite frankly, a lot of people that, maybe all they've ever heard is just, you're supposed to give this 10% tax, and that's how they see it, and they're not going to do it. And it's an all or nothing proposition. And they really don't understand some of the deeper theological motivations of why they would want to give and why they're called to give. So glad to hear some of Jim's take on this as well. But I think that's one of the largest lids to generosity. We perceive it's some that are unable or maybe in debt or this or that. But even I think debt experts like Dave Ramsey, Rachel Cruz, who are so excellent at this topic, would even say, in order for someone to get out of debt, they need to be motivated by something greater. Now, the famous line from FPU, live like no one else so you could live like no one else. Well, once you're motivated to give and you understand that, you live like no one else so you can give like no one else. But a lot of people haven't been set that inspirational goal. So they might want to be going on a vacation, or so they're going to get out of debt to do that. But the people that are inspired to give, then it motivates them to become unable. But so you've got to inspire and inform them spiritually first.
Mic drop right there. That's awesome. The 4 U's. You know what? I hadn't heard about that before, but your life just flashes before your eyes when you hear that laid out that way. So good. Jim, what would you say are some lids to generosity?
Yeah, I'm going to be in the same category, Carey. I'm going to simplify it, and just everything that Julie said is going to fit under my one big lid. And the one big lid that I see, and it has lots of subcategories underneath it, some of which Julie has listed right there, and that is that we're seeking tactical solutions to a transformational challenge. And that's exactly what Julie's talking about when she says we're spending all of our time talking about where the money goes to and not spending any time we're talking about where the money comes from. And what that means is we're applying more of a fundraising ideology over the top of a biblical stewardship problem. And that's why we're blocked at getting solutions. And so the answer is we have to just really flip the script in America. I think it's happened in the boomer generation for the most part, that we've begun to talk way too much about giving to the church and not talking about where it comes from, to the extent that most church people, if you interviewed them in the lobby on Sunday morning, why do you give? Why do you give? They would say to fund the ministry of my church. And that actually has nothing to do with why you give. You give because your giving is a God encounter, an encounter with you and God over your money and possessions. And then the church becomes the beneficiary of what happens when you and God have that encounter. So that to me is the lid, and all the other things are just symptomatic of the larger problem, that it is a spiritual issue. We, as Christ followers, our relationship with money is not financial. It's a financial tool, but our relationship is spiritual. Jesus made that very clear when he talked about the two altars, and he said God and mammon. They're two separate altars. So he gave money a spiritual characteristic right then and there. And so we just have to be mindful of that. And so I think my lids are the same as Julie's, it just express a little different way.
Can you explain a little bit more, just so I'm clear, what the difference is between what I'm giving to and what I'm giving from? The from part. What do you mean exactly by the from part?
Well, I'll give you a verse and then I'll let Julie lay in there on it, because my favorite verse on that is Philippians 4:17, where Paul was thanking the Philippians. I stumbled on this a few years ago, had no idea that Paul spoke to the issue, and he did. When he said, I sought the gift, not for the fruit that abounds to my account, but for what abounds to your account. And so what he was saying is, I know you gave to my ministry and you helped make ends meet, and I was able to do everything that I do. But of course, Philippians is about joy. But the greater joy I took was what happened to you? What happened in your life when you gave to my ministry? And for me, that kind of centers around Deuteronomy 14:23, where it goes through the recitation of the tithe. And then he says behind the comma that you might revere the name of the Lord your God always. And I think we just lose that in the translation somewhere, Carey, that is then all those thousands of years ago. And today, that's why we give, is because of our relationship with God, not because my church needs my money.
We as church leaders have the opportunity, and pastors, to be able to influence people in how we lead them in that way. So even if you think, you're a church leader and you're thinking about, okay, how am I leading people more on the giving to or the giving from? And most, without thinking about it, would say, I'm probably leading pretty heavily on the two. And there's a huge opportunity when we haven't been discipling the from to move the needle in a significant way. Because when you think about vehicles like offering moments or giving statements or videos, or just all those things are vehicles through which we're discipling either on the to or the from. Most churches do a pretty excellent job. In fact, I think on David's stats here, 8 and 10 would say that churches do a good job talking about the impact. So they're winning. They're doing good on the giving too. But if we take a cue from the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, there's the longest continuous running on teaching in Scripture is in those two chapters. And what's interesting is in those two chapters, Paul spends about this much time, meaning half of one verse, talking about where the money is going to, that it was actually the offerings that were being received in those chapters were going to some of the poor churches in Jerusalem. He spends 99.99%, all of the rest of the balance of those, encouraging the heart of the giver of what that heart should look like as they're doing the giving. And it's really interesting because as church leaders, we often don't give anywhere near that balance. It might be 70% we're talking about vision and 30% about discipleship. So it's really interesting. It doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about vision at all. I think even the distortion and sometimes distrust in our day and age of where the money is going warrants us to talk about where the money is going, the impact it's having, but we're significantly deficient, most churches and pastors, on moving the needle on the from.
Yeah, it's interesting, having been out of the lead pastor seat for a few years now, I've been thinking quite a bit lately about churches are really good at focusing on the needs of the organization, but not so much on the needs of the member or attender. In other words, what do I need to have true in my life Monday through Saturday? for me to authentically live out the mission that God has called me in terms of generosity, in terms of vocation, in terms of my everyday life, in terms of my interaction with my neighbors. And giving is a part of it. Like, my need to give exceeds the need of any organization to receive, if that makes any sense.
That's
In other words, if my church said, hey, and we give to our church, we love giving to our church. But if my church was like, hey, you know what, we can't take any more money, our bank accounts are full, that doesn't stop me from needing to give. I then have to find a new place to give money. But I don't think I didn't think about it from that perspective enough when I was in the lead seat. Any thoughts on that? Like, how pastors can get into the heads and hearts, I don't mean in a manipulative way, in a healthy way, of the people that they're serving?
Honestly, I think a big part of it is the impetus. Often when a pastor starts having this conversation, is there's some kind of an impetus. It's either a needs impetus or an opportunity impetus. So there's a needs impetus because their giving is down, or there's an opportunity impetus because there's a new campus that needs to be launched, a new mission that needs to be funded, a building that needs to be built. And that's not bad. Those things are both wonderful realities. Well, the need, not so much, but the opportunity. But I think the ongoing spiritual needs of their congregation is harder to have an impetus for that. It's ongoing to know, and it really does come from the deeper study of Scripture. Oftentimes, the last time a pastor has read Philippians 4 or 2 Corinthians 8-9 was the last time they did their capital campaign, and that shouldn't be true. It should be that just, whether you're more of a topical teacher or whether you're more of an expository teacher, there is no excuse for us not having more regular kind of teaching on that, just in general, even without the impetus of a need or an opportunity. So I think that's some of the symptoms why it does occur. And the solution is just this more intentional study of these passages of Scripture, and actually taking a cue from the Apostle Paul and even Jesus, who did almost 100% teaching on the giving from, and almost 0% on the giving to. But Jim, please feel free.
Yeah, I think the whole thing for me, Julie, is I go back and I just think how many times I've spent behind the closed doors of a church with the senior leader of that church, helping them get the script right inside of them. It's the discord and the tension that they're feeling in themselves. And a lot of time, Carey, that discord and tension they're feeling is the from and to tension, right? They've been talking to, my budget is running short, I need some more money. My budget is this, we have this, they've been talking to, and then inadvertently. And so what it feels like is when you're trying to ask for money, that there's some sort of a self-serving need that's attached to it. And I was like, Pastor, it's not about you. It's not about what your church is receiving. It's about what they need. And once you get the script right within them, you can get that discord and that tension out of them, and they're truly speaking from type language. Everything gets better. Because the issue, what they have is they have bad scripts, and they get feedback because they had bad scripts, because at the end of the day, they'll sort of say from, but everything else they're doing is to. And so the churchgoer smells that misalignment, and they begin to distrust. And that's when you get the negative emails and the push. Oh, here he comes talking about money again. Well, talking about money can't be an issue, because Dave Ramsey does it all the time. And we would all know he is brusque, and to a point, maybe even sometimes rude. I like it. Sort of like, hey, bro, you knew what he was going to say before you asked the question when you told him about your car, right? You already knew the answer. And so the talking about money is not the issue. Talking right about the money is the real issue. And most pastors, when they get at that alignment of everything you do is about from, and everything you say is about from, now the tension is gone, and you're free to talk, and you're not going to get the pushback, because people really do understand. Andy said it, and this is really Philippians 4:17, put into Andy Stanley language. It's not what we want from you, it's what we want for you. That's Philippians 4:17.
So you have, and Jim, I'll start with you. You have a unique window into pastors' lives because you met with hundreds, maybe over 1,000 pastors. Mm-hmm. So when you get behind closed doors, the mics aren't on, there's nobody else in the room. What are pastors' secret fears, struggles, worries about money, whether that's their personal finance or church finance or raising money?
Most of it starts with their own personal financial journey. I think one of the CPA firms, I'm going to say it was Cape and Krause, but it might have been one of the others, did a survey of tax return, or released the statistics on survey of tax returns several years ago, and they do a lot of pastors. And what was the statistic? It was less than half the pastors were giving 10% or more of their income to the church, something like that. It was a fairly, I'm probably misquoting that, but it was not anywhere near where you thought it should be. Let's leave it that way. It's nowhere near where you thought it should be. Well, that aligns with what I'm seeing behind closed doors. So we start, and Julie and I are going to want to make sure if the pastor's not a giver, then it's going to be hard for him or her to stand up and really become an evangelist and an advocate for whatever they're doing in this next giving acceleration season. And so we have to get the script right within them, which for me, frankly, most of the prisons that I've seen these pastors in are self-constructed prisons. They're self-constructed. Most of them have no basis in reality. They come from bad scripts, bad stories, pushback for the wrong reasons, something that happened in another church, something that happened to their friend in another church. And if we can get that out of them and get them onto this narrative, this 2 Corinthians 8:9 narrative, where we're talking a lot about from and not so much about to, it frees them up and they have a new life. They've never seen it that way. And that's been fun to do. That's been fun to do for me.
Powerful. Julie, what do you see when you get behind closed doors?
It's really interesting because so many of these journeys start from the day that they were a church planter. And that's one of the hardest things. I know Jim and I are both really passionate. Every year we always have a batch of church planters. We just coach on the side for free because we love doing it. And because so much of that poverty mentality begins in that stage, because these guys and gals, they're just out there working. I mean, you guys know this, they're working so hard to give everything they've got in order to make this church plant work. But oftentimes that does mean that, their household is maybe not the best financially all the time. And it does become, it's becoming from a spirit of generosity initially, but sometimes that actually can swing their pendulum in a different direction towards resentment of, well, all these years we gave up all of this. And so, now we're not going to do that. And so it's interesting. Some of it gets birthed very, very, very young into their tenure as a pastor, or that they had some type of an experience, like Jim said, a wounding at a prior church, maybe even a sending church or another staff that they weren't a part of. So doing the best that we can to try to deconstruct some of that and rebuild it within them is a huge part of them being able to disciple others.
So let's assume you've read the mail of a meaningful percentage of people listening to this podcast. How do you get past the shame of that, the embarrassment of that, gosh, I didn't want anyone to know? And to be fair, I'll go on the record again as saying most pastors are not overpaid. From what I know of the church, that stuff on social media, in the media about the pastor who, has a private jet, that is like such a fractional percentage of the church. Most pastors, I would say, are adequately or underpaid, and probably emphasis on under. But when that's a real issue and money is tight, how do you get past the stigma, the shame, the embarrassment, I don't want to show anyone my finances. I'm not proud of this. How do you get there? How do you get past that?
So I think the starting point, Carey, is helping them to shape the narrative in a way that's authentic without having to say everything. I think there's ways to say what you need to say without declaring that, if they're just really a mess, which I don't find very many of those. I find a lot who are just in that, I'm not tithing and here's why. Okay. They're giving, but they're not tithing. And that's really kind of the block for them that they feel. And so, maybe the way of framing that is like just, because Julie and I are both going to advocate that the pastor needs to lead the way in talking about giving and sharing it in a way that says, like you, I'm a work in process. We're working on our giving strategy here just as you are. And what we're intending to do in this next season is we're intending to take a big step, and we're asking you to do that as well. That's not, he knows the whole story. I know the whole story, but he doesn't need to tell it in such a way that he's really just kind of, as we would say, pull the kimono all the way back. There's no need to do that. There's ways to do this and preserve, kind of whatever shame might be there. And I always tell them, look, there's no reason to feel guilt or shame here. But what is it that Joby Martin says? It's okay. It's okay to not be okay. It's just not okay to stay there, right? I think Joby was one of the ones who said that. And that's really what I'm trying to help them to understand is let's find you a pathway forward. By the way, one of the things they don't know is that they can get specialized pastor coaching at Dave Ramsey. I mean, and a lot of times that's helpful because sometimes you do need what I call the financial clinic to just get you out of this mess that you're in. For a lot of them, not surprisingly, this is not going to shock anybody here. It's student debt from college education, college and seminary education, which is another problem altogether that we've got to solve. But I think there are ways to do it without having to, expose shame and guilt.
Yeah, I would agree. Sometimes it's just helpful for a moment to take the numerics out of it. Because often when we say someone is growing in their giving and a pastor feels this, I'll even say sometimes undue pressure that he or she needs to give either a larger amount or a larger percentage in order to be growing in their giving. Most of the time that's true, but that is not true 100% of the time, because a pastor who previously had no kids in college and then now is in a season where he has 3 kids in college, that is very possibly a sense where numerically he might not be giving a larger number or a larger percentage in that season, but does that mean he can't still grow in his giving? Absolutely, he can. It's the definition of what that means. And so growing in your giving means growing in your, if you're discipling someone, that means they're looking more like Christ in how they give. So that means these inputs, like the theology of first and understanding that your giving is your top priority, the theology of eternal perspective and understanding that your earthly assets should actually have an eternal purpose, and the theology of surrender, that everything we have is the Lord's. And he can grow in his understanding of those things in a massive way, even in a season where he actually might be giving less financially. And a lot of people go into output oppression, meaning their outputs, their dollars or their percentages that they are giving. They go into oppression and never grow on their inputs because they might be going through a very legitimate season where by the grace of God, they're funding their kids' education. And it feels like they can't grow in their giving because they're focused on numerics. And actually the thing we should be focusing on is their inputs. I could say a lot more about that, but in short, that's what I would say.
I'd love to look back on the last 18 months with you all. And obviously the pandemic has been a great revealer of things that we probably knew to be true, but really understood them in new ways. And it's obviously changed a lot. Some things haven't changed much at all. And we've said on this podcast, like, we expected giving to be, sort of greatly disrupted. And in the end, it's only been sort of moderately disrupted, mostly because the economy has done well. And, now we have inflation pressures and other things. But what do you think has been revealed by the pandemic? And then what do you think is a lasting change from the last 18 months that churches will need to grapple with when it comes to generosity?
Yeah, something that's probably been revealed by the pandemic. Some of the statistics Jim and I have been seeing in churches is that maybe a church that previously had 1,500 giving households now has 700. I think there's definitely been a refining process. There is, while the top line giving, as David accurately shared, is either stable or actually up across the board in many cases, the number of givers is significantly down. And so there is more giving happening from significantly less people. So I think the pandemic definitely has revealed, to answer your question, revealed that just the committed nature of people, a lot of the peripheral or people that were giving at modest amounts just aren't giving anymore at all. And I think your other question, I think, was what it has sustained. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, what's a long lasting change you think leaders should expect in relation to the pandemic?
Yeah, I know it's the buzzword of the pandemic day, so I don't want to even say it, but engagement, I know that word is said so much it loses its meaning, but I do think that that's the key as far as these, it remains to be seen. Is this a temporary situation where we've got this group of very committed givers kind of making up the difference for the others? Is this temporary because they were standing in the gap, or is it permanent? Regardless, we need to step up our engagement game. And so I think, a lot of the things, thinking about how we engage people, it's much more difficult to engage people digitally than physically, and all these different things, that those are the lead indicators. The lag indicator often is their giving. And so all these things that I know so many great experts are working on in the broader scope of engagement, the giving is usually going to be an offshoot of those broader engagement pieces. So I think that's the piece that we really have to pay attention to ongoing.
Jim, how about you? Anything else?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things, David. I've been through 2 or 3 economic adjustments while in my season at Generis, and I'm going to maintain the same thing last year that I've said in every other giving adjustment, even though, it didn't play out the way we thought it would in terms of decline, as Julie's talking about. It has reshaped giving very significantly, and that is that hard times don't cause giving to go away. They just accelerate a trend that was already in place. And that's both in terms of giving and whether the church is doing well. So if you show me a church that's really struggling in COVID, I'd take you back to 2019 and show you where they were already struggling. So you get this downward pressure that comes into an already struggling organization, and it doesn't have any backbone to really sustain it. But a downward pressure on a healthy organizations are able to stabilize and get through this. And so that happened again. Now, we're one of the ones who thought the giving was going to go down because we had a lot of content teed up for that. And like, whoa, we need to go in another direction because that's not where it's playing out. I think the other thing that's been clearly revealed, and Carey and I have talked about this in some private conversations, and that is that, if we suspected we had a discipleship problem in America, we now know we do. We know we do. The discipleship culture of the American church has been exposed as being insufficient. And COVID did that. And I'm glad for that. I think we've all suspected that all the way back to maybe the Reveal study and some of what was in there. So it's not a shocker because I don't know that we've done anything really to get any better since the time of the Reveal study. And so, I think that, and I think see lots of churches that are really taking some healthy attitudes toward, how do we solve that? We can't just keep doing what we've been doing. And that would be around giving, the well-discipled people are continuing to give. I mean, that's Julie's statistics. They are. And the ones who are not well-discipled are, they're fading away. By the way, there also is always a real churn going on. So part of the reason why we're losing givers is we're not attracting new givers, and we've got givers going out the back door. That's really what's happening in this season. What I see going on longer term, Julie touched on it, but I would just say we need different scorecards. We got to have different scorecards going forward. We can't just rely on the number of people who fill a seat on Sunday morning and how much they give. We have to have other scorecards that really measure these levels of engagement. And we have to make sure these levels of engagement are pointing toward more meaningful discipleship, not just being a parking lot volunteer on Sunday morning.
Okay, can we do a lightning round as we wrap up today? Just a couple of really quick questions. Here's one. Tips to activate non-givers. Julie?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that this is the quickest answer I would say is an invitation. So often when we do our offering moments, they are assumptive. They are not invitational. And so an encouragement to pastors, any communication, whether it's an offering moment, whether it's a giving statement, whether it's an email, actually invite to say, you know what, last month we had 77 first-time givers. I just want to invite you. If you've never taken that step before, make today your day. And I know that sounds silly and simple, but my goodness, we've got to celebrate people that are taking the step. So share that stat and then invite people to actually take the step. And then of course, the practical ways to give are great, but the actual verbal invitation is huge.
Great. Non-givers, Jim?
Yeah, I love that. And I think, Carey, the main thing is give them something easy to start with. Don't take them into the gym and immediately say, you've got to bench press 200 pounds. Give them a 5-pound dumbbell. Give them an easy way to start their giving step today, because you start your giving story, you'll become a giver.
Okay, Jim, digital giving. Where's that going? What's your advice to church leaders?
Gosh, the wonderful thing about digital giving is we have so many great platforms out there. There was one that came to America some years ago and really, I think, revolutionized it. Everybody knows who I'm talking about, but I'm not going to call the name. And now everybody has a great platform. And so what I would say to everyone out there is just make sure you have a great platform, call attention to it, make sure that that you're making it super easy for your people. And because I know Julie will say this, I'll go ahead and say this so we can both be on record as saying, don't assume your recurring givers need to just stay there. Call attention to them every now and then and activate. Go in and take a look at your giving. Maybe your financial situation has changed and you need to think about, redoing your giving online, because the downside is out of sight is out of mind.
Yeah.
And just help them to grow in their giving, even if they're recurring givers there.
Online giving, Julie?
Yeah, it's exactly just to piggyback off what Jim said. It is a helpful tool. that the majority of the people benefit from that tool because there are sporadic or occasional givers. So if you're a sporadic giver, an occasional giver, you will benefit from an online kind of recurring gift. If you are complacent in that, it's not the end all be all. And I think that's the big caution, is that digital giving, it is auto draft becomes autopilot very easily. And so it still requires it. It's great because it feels like a subscription-based business like Netflix. You've got your money coming in, but if you really care about discipleship, it might be that that person hasn't revisited that amount in a while. So that's the caution, that we don't let that auto draft become autopilot for those people.
Oh, that's good. Auto draft becomes autopilot. That'll preach. Final word of encouragement to pastors in what has been a very discouraging season for so many leaders.
I'd say, Pastor, you can do this. It's going to require for some of you some turns in the road. For some of you, maybe some bigger turns in the road than others, but you can do this, and you'll be blessed by what happens to your people when you go down the road of speaking consistently and aligning everything in your church around the from and not so much to the to. I would even say, if you spend more time on the from, the to will be much bigger than it is when you're just shooting at the to. You can do this, Pastor. I know you can.
Yeah, and it's just been so encouraging to see. I know this has been, man, one of the most weary seasons. I think if you're a pastor or if you're like a school administrator, I mean, there's just these couple of industries that have gotten hit really hard in terms of multiple opinions on every single subject in the world. And so we love you. We pray for you constantly. And this particular subject, I mean, when in doubt, just stick to scripture of what you're calling people to in this season. And we have seen just some incredible, encouraging leadership come out from so many of you, from all of you, and just blessed to have, to be a fly on the wall so many times in those conversations.
Well, Jim and Julie, thank you so much for being with us today. And Generis and you guys will be participating in the Generosity Collab, which is coming up. There's still time to register. David, any thoughts on Collab? If there's a leader wondering, hey, what's it like? Is it interactive? Like, it's not just a download thing, right?
Correct. It's very interactive, and we just would be delighted to have church leaders join us. I think the nature of this conversation today is just a little bit of a preview. Julie will be joining us, and we work through content, exercises, homework. If you choose to do any of it, assessment work that you can take to your people, where you're actually hearing from them about how they're doing. And I think all the things we've been talking about, this question of like, what are the paradigms that drive us? How do we really understand how to more effectively accelerate generosity in our community? I think leaders are going to be well served by the collab. So I really invite you to be a part of it.
Yeah. So if you want to sign up, you can go to barna.com/collab, use the promo code ChurchPulse15. And also remember our good friends at Belay. They know you didn't sign up to run the church finances, so maybe you need some help. And they've got a free document for you, 5 ways a church bookkeeper can transform your day. You can get it for free by texting the word pulse to 55123. That's pulse to 55123. Anyway, and once again, for Generis, you can check out everything Generis as well over at generis.com. Right, Jim?
Yeah. Generis.com.
Fantastic. As I always say, it's Genesis with an R, if you're wondering how to spell that and you're driving or running somewhere. So anyway, so appreciate you guys. David, thank you. We'll do this again next time. And thank you to all of you who've tuned in for this episode of Church Pulse Weekly. You can get it, of course, anywhere you get your podcast. Tell your friends about it, any colleagues in ministry, and leave a rating and review if you would be so kind. And we'll see you next time on Church Pulse Weekly.